Of the three domains of institutional reconstruction that we will address in the next several weeks, we have begun to discuss the first, the democratization of the economy, with an emphasis on the future of the knowledge economy, the most advanced practice of production. Then we will go on to the second, the deepening of democracy, the reshaping of democratic politics, which I hope at least to begin today and to continue after the break, and then the reformation of education and the formation of the capable worker and citizen. Now, I remind you of the general outline of our discussion of the democratization of the market and the possible content of a progressive project in political economy. There are three themes that I suggested to be paramount. The relation between the advanced and backward sectors of the production system, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to the real economy. And as we have had at least some discussion of the last two, the focus now is on the first, which is, in a sense, the most important and the least discussed. So in the last class, I proposed a characterization of the knowledge economy, not just in its salient and visible characteristics, the characteristics that it displays even in its present form, but also in its deeper attributes, those that have to do with a potential that is to some extent suppressed in its present existence. Suppressed because the knowledge economy as it now exists only as a fringe that is present in every part of the production system, in every sector. It is, in this sense, multi-sectoral. But in each sector as an island from which the large majority of firms and workers remain excluded. So a fundamental idea in this argument, an idea that is not self-evident, but that I began to defend last week, is that the deepening of a practice of production and its dissemination are two sides of the same phenomenon. It deepens, that is to say, it develops its characteristics and reveals and achieves its potential only in the course of spreading. And to the extent that it remains under quarantine, as it now is, its deeper characteristics are not manifest. The second part of the discussion was then an argument about the nature, the consequences, and the causes of the confinement of the knowledge economy. And the two most significant consequences are the slowing in the growth of productivity, the ascent of productivity, and therefore a slowdown in economic growth itself, and the aggravation of economic inequality. But there is a third consequence that we can add to these two that is less tangible, but no less important. And the third consequence is the consignment of the majority of the labor force, even in the most advanced economies and in the relatively most egalitarian societies, to what is in effect make work. And there results from this situation an experience of belittlement, of humiliation, of the suppression of human possibility. So the attempt to overcome this insulation, this isolation of the knowledge economy, this limitation of the knowledge economy to a series of exclusive fringes, is a subject of immense importance to the contemporary societies and should be of central importance to the progressives. The progressives generally say that their main concern is inequality, and the greatest motor of the aggravation of inequality has become the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, its division between advanced and backward sectors. The resulting inequalities are so far-reaching, they're so profound, that the traditional devices of compensatory and retrospective redistribution through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements are entirely inadequate to the task of containing inequality. The only adequate response to this problem would be to deal with it in its structural source, in this fundamental division between the advanced and backward parts of production. The argument about the nature and consequences and causes of the confinement of the knowledge economy in turn led to the third step of the argument, which is the observation of what has become a central dilemma in the worldwide debate about economic development or growth. Now, you know that traditionally there is an argument about development, meaning about the economic growth of the emerging economies, and then an argument about growth in the central or richest economies. And this is just an accidental historical division because the problems are fundamentally the same, as we are beginning increasingly to realize. And this dilemma is a dilemma that affects equally the richest economies and the developing countries. The dilemma then is this: the traditional, the received shortcut to economic growth, which has been conventional industrialization. Industrialization in the mode of what we call Fordist mass production has stopped working. Conventional industrialization is no longer the shortcut that it used to be. And countries all over the world are deindustrializing. Conventional mass production has ceased to be the vanguard. It is what I described last week as either a leftover of an earlier advanced practice of production or a sidekick, a satellite to the new vanguard, the vanguard of the knowledge economy, which subcontracts, delegates to it the parts of the production process that can be routinized or transformed into commodities. And increasingly, this vanguard is able to outproduce conventional industry, producing more, better, and more cheaply the goods and services that conventional industry used to make. So that's one horn of the dilemma. The other horn of the dilemma is that the alternative to conventional industrialization, which would be an inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. The knowledge economy exists in the world today only in its insular form. Nowhere does it exist in its disseminated and deepened possible form. Not even in the richest economy with the most educated populations. And then we think, if an inclusive form of the knowledge economy does not exist, even in the richest countries, how could we expect it to exist in the others? That's the dilemma. And it seems, this was the general thrust of the argument I made last week, that there is no prospect of breaking this dilemma on the first side by bringing conventional industry back to life. The most that can be done is to buy a few more years through negative or defensive measures, subsidies, protectionism, restraints on offshoring, and so forth. And these negative measures have, in fact, despite their lack of prospect, been the main focus of both the conventional social democrats in their industrial policy and of the right-wing populists. A losing project on this view. The only chance to break the dilemma, I argued, was to break it on the second side by making the seemingly impossible task of establishing an inclusive form of the knowledge economy somehow feasible. And doing it by breaking up that task into stages or steps or pieces so that the unmanageable would become manageable. So there you have as the center, what is increasingly becoming the focus of the worldwide debate about growth and development, which is only just beginning to penetrate economic theory and apparently has not yet penetrated the general political discourse. And so that then becomes the main object of the argument. That's where we came to. And I then suggested that we can distinguish three families of requirements for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. Educational or cognitive requirements, moral or social requirements, and legal and institutional requirements. The third is the most complex. And we shouldn't think of the combination of these requirements as a system that has to be established either all together and all at once or not at all. We should think of it in the spirit of combined and uneven development, in which we can, according to circumstance, advance first and more rapidly on one front until we hit against limits that are imposed by the failure to advance on other fronts. And then this imbalance in the process of reconstruction rather than becoming a fatal difficulty, can serve as an opportunity because it then instigates or guides the effort at further transformation. And furthermore, I want to remind you of a methodological feature of these arguments related to an idea that we discussed earlier in the course. Deliberately, in the characterization of these requirements, I am focusing, for the most part, on a middle part of the spectrum. That is, on changes that are neither very close to what exists, nor very far away from what exists. Because this middle part of the spectrum is the part that is most useful for conceptual clarification. But it is rarely the part of the spectrum that is most effective in transformative practice and political discourse. Because, as I suggested earlier, it is too far from what exists to seem immediately feasible, but not far enough to arouse enthusiasm. And therefore, in the practice of political discourse, we have reason to avoid this middle part of the spectrum and combine instead the very proximate and the very remote, that is to say, the practical and the prophetic. But they're all parts of the same set of ideas and alternatives. And we, in our minds, must correct for these circumstantial adaptations and move simultaneously at all of these levels. So at the end of the last class, I focused on the educational and cognitive requirements. And in particular, I draw your attention to the general idea of the pedagogic paradigm, the way of teaching and of learning that seems to be demanded by the knowledge economy. Conventional industrial mass production requires very little by way of education. But this practice of production really does require a particular formation of the mind. And I suggested 4 sets of characteristics of this way of teaching and of learning that would apply equally to general education and to vocational or technical training. And indeed, in this world of the knowledge economy, the distinction between general education and technical or vocational training is only relative. So first, the priority accorded to the analytic and synthetic capabilities of imaginative thinking. The mind on its second side, the mind as an anti-machine, the mind as imagination. The primacy of these analytic and synthetic skills over the mastery of content or of information. The second characteristic has to do with the fact that these capabilities can never be acquired in a vacuum of content, but only in dealing with content, even though content itself is relatively less important. But what matters with respect to content is not amplitude or coverage, encyclopedic reach, but rather selective depth. And thus the importance of a form of learning that focuses on themes or projects. The third characteristic has to do with the social setting of education, which, as much as possible, should reproduce the social characteristics of advanced scientific work, which is cooperative. Teamwork, cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, exploiting to the hilt the potential of contemporary information and communication technologies. And the fourth characteristic, which is the least familiar and the most troubling, is that education be dialectical and approach every subject from contrasting points of view, seeking to make what appears to be natural seem strange. And breaking apart the forced marriage between methods and subject matters that characterizes the orthodoxies of the university culture, projected back to the national curriculums of the world, which I claim were a kind of infantilization of these orthodoxies. Now, of course, the redirection of education in this way is no minor technical project. It requires a whole view of society, of the mind, and it requires as its agent a pedagogic vanguard of hundreds, thousands of teachers and experts who become the co-authors of this project and develop the practices and the materials that it demands. And it is all the more ambitious because we shouldn't think of it as simply a project for original education or education of youth, but also for lifelong education, continuing throughout the careers of the workers and citizens. So this is then a summary of the first set of requirements. And before going any further, because we didn't have proper time for discussion last week of this, let me ask whether someone would like to engage this first set of requirements and its relation to the knowledge economy. So it does have, as I suggested, we're in the American context, some proximity to the ideas of the major American educational reformer, John Dewey. But in the United States, there is a severe educational dualism, a division between two kinds of schools, and the majority of the public schools are still sunk into a much earlier stage, a more primitive stage of information and discipline-oriented teaching, as if the object were to train the students for a world of Fordist factories and bureaucracies that is ceasing to exist. Yes?
Question. Given how powerful a force inertia is,
Yes.
in your mind, what could serve as an impetus for a coordinated mass pedagogic vanguard, as you're suggesting, is required?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. It's a complicated question because in an ambitious project of transformation like this one, every single part is ambitious and seems to demand not just a huge effort, a struggle, but a change of attitude. And of course, the most important change is the self-transformation of the agents, not just as if they were struggling against objective material interests in the outside society. And what can motivate that? Because each part of this program has uses and benefits that it produces, but they're not enough, as you're implying in your observation, in your question, to justify this whole effort. So it has to be something about the whole package. And in which the parts are seen as simply dimensions of this larger project of transformation. And so there must be a visionary element, a prophetic element, which is not reduced to the debates of electoral politics, that seeps into the culture, into consciousness. It has a spiritual or a religious aspect. It has to do with our conception of ourselves. And for it to be sustained, for it to be powerful, there has to be, it seems, something that has to do with a psychological dynamic of empowerment. So in other words, each part of a project like this one has the effect of enhancing our agency, our ability to act. And thinking is a kind of action, so that we're not passive, so that we act within the context, beyond the context, against the context. And there's a kind of bet that this experience of empowerment is seductive, that it's irresistible, that it's not just like persuading us coldly to take a different view of things. It's changing in some way the character of our experience, so that if we become relatively more empowered in one domain, we're much more likely to face the difficulties of a similar aspect of empowerment in another domain. Seems to me that must be part of the answer, that we have to imagine that this is that this has to do with a subtle but cumulative change in the character of experience. And now this is related to another question, a philosophical question that is always in the background of our arguments. And one way in which I can make it clear is by contrast to the romantic view. So one of the characteristics of Romanticism, not just the Romantic movement of the early 19th century Europe, but romance in a larger sense, with a larger history, is that it has a binary view of experience. So it says, we are only fully alive, we're only really ourselves when we begin to shake the structures in those interludes of disruption. So for the romantic imagination, there is a distribution of temperaments in humanity, and the disruptors are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. They're the agents of this shaking of the routines. And now, the routines are repetition, structure in all of its forms, political and personal. For example, in the romantic imagination, romantic love, by contrast to the routines of married life. In the political imagination, the crowd in the streets, the protesters, the revolutionary mob, by contrast to the bureaucratic apparatus. And the romantic idea has as one of its fundamental flaws or illusions a kind of despair, a deficiency of hope. What it despairs of is the possibility that we could change the relation between spirit and structure. So what it believes is that we're fully alive only in those interludes in which we shake the structures. The structures will come back, inevitably. And they will then be again like the hand of Midas killing the spirit. So it's like Mao organizes the Cultural Revolution, and there'll be a disruption of the bureaucratic apparatus. He knows that the bureaucratic apparatus will come back. But this shaking then breaks it apart temporarily in its fossilized form. And it's a return to life, to a higher form of life, which, on this romantic view, is by its very nature transient. So this view is false, because it's not true that there's an invariant relation between structure and spirit. We can change the relation between spirit and structure. We can create structures that, to an increasing extent, are not just there as if they were part of the furniture of the universe, natural phenomena, an alien fate. We can create structures that, to a greater extent, invite their own revision and relativize the difference between being in them and being out of them, so that, to a greater extent, we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And all of these arguments, in all of these domains of institutional reconstruction, in some sense have to do with that. That's one of the unifying themes. And the psychological expression of this change in the relation between life and structure is this experience of empowerment, that we become bigger, that we don't just have these two forms of existence, ordinary routine existence in which we take a framework for granted and we're like sleepwalking. And then from time to time we're woken up by crisis and disruption when we're really alive, the romantic idea. As opposed to the conception that little by little, step by step, the character of our routine experience might be transformed. Then we become higher. And this is a different idea, a fundamentally different idea, which is anti-romantic in that sense. And the different conception of the possibilities of social life. So I think that's what's really at stake in your very profound question. And it has as its psychological experience this dimension of empowerment, of the enhancement of agency, which is in turn related to this notion that I have defended here, that the central aim of the progressives is not equality, but a shared bigness. And equality is subsidiary to that. That is the avoidance of extreme inequality. We become greater. We become greater together. Yes?
You spoke about the educational skills and the different methodologies necessary in order to adapt to the knowledge economy. And when you were describing this approach of more task-based thematic education, I was thinking that this is in stark contrast with the holistic approach to education, which is the fruit of enlightenment, the homo universalis. And this, I think, it's still the paradigm in continental Europe, having a more...
An encyclopedia.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Encyclopedia. Now, I don't want to defend one of the two, but do you think there's a trade-off between the two paradigms, and we lose something if we move from one to the other?
No.
And if you could put it in the context of misinformation and...
No, because I think there's, of course, you're right to point out that there's an ambiguity in the idea of selectivity, because selectivity might be interpreted as specialization, and specialization is then the opposite of a larger view. But that's not the connotation of selectivity here. The connotation of selectivity is depth. So you go deeply into a phenomenon. But in dealing with that phenomenon, you have to develop very general ideas about everything else that it's connected with. So it's not selectivity in the sense of technical specialization. It's selectivity in the sense of understanding the whole. So Marcel Proust can attend a few dinner parties, but he's not writing a book that specializes in dinner parties. It's that the minute phenomena are the doorway or the gateway to an understanding of something very big, which you see the whole, but you see the whole by looking up close at humanity in some particular aspect. So that's the idea. And one of the problems with the alternative conventional approach of the encyclopedia is that there is no uncontroversial encyclopedia. So every encyclopedia is someone's system, someone's canon, which is then being presented delusively as if it were the way things are. And that's what happens in these cultures. So in these traditional European cultures, like traditionally said in France, that the Minister of Education could look at his watch and he would know at a certain time of day what page of Descartes all the kids were reading. The problem is that this is someone's canon, and that is then being, as it were, naturalized. And that's then being confused with the idea of having a general education. It's not an introduction to the wholeness of things. It's an introduction to a dogmatic system, which is confused with the wholeness of things. And so the issue from the standpoint of someone interested in the liberation of the mind is, how do you develop a holistic view? And the suggestion is, you don't develop it by focusing your training on the mastery of someone's dogmatic canon. You have to deconstruct things. And to deconstruct, you have to go deeply into particular phenomena and look at them from alternative points of view. And then you build up a more general view. But there is this ambiguity, there is this difficulty that you point to. Yes? But work now in what sense do you mean? Yes, well, of course, the connection is this notion that in a radicalized and disseminated form, and on this idea, dissemination and radicalization are two sides of the same transformation, the same thing. Everyone needs these higher order capabilities. So if you just take it at the narrowest form, which doesn't do justice to the knowledge economy, just the machines. So the central mechanical repertoire of industrial mass production are these traditional devices like machine cutting lathes. And there are repetitious movements of the 6 main types of lathes, and you learn them. And in a sense, the movements of the operator reflect the movements of the machine. They're in the same continuum. In a numerically controlled machine tool, it's different. because it has no single set of operations. You can reprogram it continuously. And if you're using, for example, a 3D printer in additive manufacturing, you go back and forth between a conception of a product and its materialization, the way a scientist would with his conjectures. And to do that, to take advantage of the potential of that technology, you have to have then higher order capabilities. And if you now expand the line of reasoning to not just making things, but experimenting with the forms of cooperation in the division of labor, then it's the same thing. You need to have an open mind with this experimental characteristic, with these higher order capacities. And I think, as was suggested before in the earlier comment, it's difficult to believe that any society would undertake such an ambitious educational transformation if it were motivated solely by the pragmatic imperative of using to the hilt the potential of these technologies. It would be rather the opposite, that you'd think that the provocation to use these technologies most effectively is an opportunity to undertake all sorts of other transformations and enhancements that have independent value for culture, for politics, for the creation of a greater individual, and so forth. Because if you looked at them only in the narrowest form of who is the most effective operator of these kinds of machines, you would stop earlier in this project. You wouldn't keep going, I think. And then we would have another version of what I've been calling the path of least resistance.
So this is supposed to, when you were saying before in the previous lecture about innovation, or like the knowledge economy incorporating innovation into this organization.
Yes.
It still seems to me that these groups, that there still will be segmentation, even if everyone were educated so that they could innovate. Some groups
Segmentation in what's it?
in the sense of certain groups being better at innovating than others, or some
Of course.
groups not being able to.
Of course.
And so there will still be this problem
Of course.
of like elite groups in creating this knowledge economy.
Of course. Of course. So this is not some instantaneous overcoming of the divisions in humanity and the divisions of talents, the divisions of temperaments. But it creates a world, it goes in the direction of creating a world in which the divisions are less rigidified. And one of the ways of making them less rigidified and of diminishing their prejudicial consequences is paradoxically to multiply them. So in other words, so there's not just one master set of divisions and they're all synchronized with one another. So that the people who have the greatest economic gains also have the most fun in their jobs and the greatest political influence and so forth. You have a more complicated structure in which there are many forms of empowerment and experiment and many different ways in which someone can excel. And that's a response, in a way, to this problem that we have, this fundamental tragedy of these societies, that there's this huge effort in the world, this bubbling of intensity, of desire. And so much of it goes up in smoke with no consequence, with no legacy. And so this is what we have to address if we take as the central problem this elevation of human life to a higher level, to more intensity, greater scope, more power, shared power. The fundamental idea. And of course, to talk about it, you see how even in these conversations we're having here in this room, we're struggling with this difficulty of how to have a discourse, a vocabulary that can be at the same time practical and visionary, prophetic. And this is what's necessary. But you can see how difficult it is. And so to be practical or realistic and to have a visionary impulse at the same time. And it's not as if this were a single transformation, that we would be either there or not there. It's a direction. So this was the argument we were just having about the romantic. So let me describe this problem in a completely different form, just to show how it is a very general problem. So in the history of science, there is this view associated with the historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, of distinguishing so-called normal science from revolutionary science. So on this view, in a discipline like fundamental physics, there are paradigms, like the Newtonian paradigm, and then there are geniuses that recreate these paradigms. And in between, the scientists are just working within the paradigm. That's routine science, until another genius comes along and breaks the paradigm. So everyone else is confined to this holding operation, working within the paradigm. But then we might think that so-called routine science could little by little take on some of the characteristics of revolutionary science. And that the simple contrast between revolutionary science and routine science would be not overcome entirely, but moderated. And there wouldn't be this absolute opposition between the geniuses and everything else, and everyone else. That would be a higher experience of science. And so it's an analogy. It's in the domain of science and the history of science to what we're discussing here in politics and economics. And this idea that, and let me just persist on this theme of genius because it's very interesting. So the philosopher Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, makes the following remark about genius and talent. He says, "A talented man is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. A genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see." And this is a penetrating remark about the nature of genius, because genius is not a kind of super intelligence or facility, a cleverness. So many people, and this is a disease of the academics, they think that because they're very smart, they have a right to be geniuses and to see things. But genius is not it's not about being smart. It's a form of vision. And so the question is, how can this faculty for vision, for the imagination of alternatives, of possibilities, be cultivated in humanity? So that the prophetic and visionary powers are disseminated within the whole of humanity. That's a form of shared greatness, shared bigness. And this form of education that I was describing could be said to have that as its ambition. So that it's to cultivate these powers of discovery, of vision, more widely in the human race. And this, of course, as we've been saying in this back and forth, the practical benefits of this are just an aspect of a bigger view of how we make ourselves greater, which is really at stake in all of this. Now that then brings us to the second set of requirements, about which I can be brief, which are the social moral requirements. So remember, in the characterization of the knowledge economy, I said it thrives on the basis of a change in the moral culture of production. So it requires a heightening of the discretionary initiative accorded to all the participants in the productive process. And therefore also of the reciprocal trust demanded of the participants. So remember the example, the contrast to the military analog of it. It's not like a command and control infantry battalion. It's like a guerrilla force or a special operations force in the theater, in which there has to be much greater flexibility, meaning more initiative for the individual combatants to revise the operational plan in the field, to disassemble and reassemble, and a higher level of trust. So what characterized the traditional forms of production and of the market order, which was a low level of trust generalized among strangers, is no longer good enough. And there has to be a heightening of the level of trust, albeit among strangers, among people who were not connected by some pre-existing group, like a kinship relation. And so that's in turn related to a discussion we had before in the arguments about civil society, of whether the willingness and the ability to cooperate can become the object of deliberate initiatives, so that it's not just a blind fact about society, a phenomenon that we are powerless to influence, but it can become the object of deliberate action. And I won't repeat the arguments we had then, but they become relevant here. So the thesis is that what the sociologists call social capital, the density of our associational connections, can be deepened and enhanced. It's not just an inalterable natural fact about society. And there's no silver bullet, there's no single instrument for this enhancement, but it can be enhanced through as the cumulative outcome of a series of different factors. And what they all have in common is this experience of doing things together. And so 3 examples from the earlier arguments of the course are, first, the cooperative character of education itself. So people would begin to cooperate very early. Second, the engagement of organized civil society outside the state in the experimental provision of public services in partnership with the state. And third, some principle of voluntary or mandatory social service in which everyone would be expected not only to have a position in the production system, but also to be responsible in some part of his life for taking care of other people outside the boundaries of family selfishness. So the flourishing of the knowledge economy outside the islands to which it is now confined seems to depend, among other things, on this enhancement of social capital, which is obviously not some instantaneous transformation, but the result of a slow movement. Now, there have actually been comparative empirical studies comparing forms of the existing knowledge economy that are relatively more or less successful. And a common observation is that the forms that are relatively more successful, like Silicon Valley itself, are characterized by a continuing circulation of people, resources, practices, and ideas among firms. So there is a cooperative background. And to some extent, this cooperative background is formalized in collaborations among firms and in the use in large sectors of the knowledge economy, like the biotech industry, of incomplete, ongoing relational contracts, which are an organization of this collaboration and of what you could call cooperative competition. So cooperative competition is when economic agents or firms compete with one another. They are bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. They're distinct. But in part of their activity, they also cooperate. And then, of course, there are practical questions, including legal questions, of how these practices of cooperative competition can be reconciled, for example, with the antitrust laws. But the main idea is the idea that the cooperative background to economic life is something that we can influence and not something that we have to just take for granted as being more or less present. So again, let me stop there and ask for your comments. Yes.
You mentioned the difference between the talented and the genius.
Yes.
The genius are those who have this visionary component. Do you see any examples of the visionary kind of figures in contemporary world or in recent history who exemplify that kind of characteristic and can serve as a model?
Well, there are many, and they're all around, right, in some senses, and yet difficult to identify. You know, Goethe said that one of the rarest of all qualities is the ability to identify genius among one's contemporaries. because it's not about power, it's about vision, and by definition a vision that the others don't have yet. But I'm not accepting, even though I used it for the purpose of my polemic, the simple romantic contrast between the geniuses and everyone else. I see this faculty of vision as being potentially widely diffused within humanity. And most clearly present in young children. So, and this is one of the tragedies of the educational system, that then this faculty of visionary immediacy, rather than being equipped, is suppressed by the encyclopedia, the dogma, and so forth. And this is one of the deep difficulties of the school under a democracy, because, and it's something which we haven't discussed, but is another aspect of this problem, that there are two great forces that stand over the school: the family and the state. So the family says to the child, become like me. And so that's why Plato said that the transformation of the society begins by taking the child away from the family. A radical solution. And then the state says to the child, serve me. It has an idea of what makes the child useful. But somehow the school cannot be simply the instrument of the family or of the state. The school has to be the voice of the future. And the school has to recognize in the child a tongue-tied prophet. Now, on what basis? Because the visible powers of the world are these powers: the state, the family, the corporations. The future has no armies. So somehow things have to be organized so that the school can play these authorities off against one another and open a space in which the mind can be given access to remote experience. And the practical benefits of a project of transformation like this one can then pave the road to the other more troubling benefits of subversion and imagination, which are connected with them. So it's like a deal, it says. If you want all this power to exploit to the hilt the potential of these practices and technologies, you have to accept a greater degree of subversion and disruption than you're happy to countenance. So who knows how this operation is to be done? I'm not pretending that it's easy. It's like squaring the circle, because in effect, what we're saying in all of these arguments is that we want the structure to jump out of itself, but that is what we want. I mean, that's the whole idea in these arguments, in which we don't believe that there's a dogmatic blueprint, unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. We believe in the primacy of structural alternatives, but we don't believe that there's a univocal, permanent form of the structural alternative. So we want the alternatives that we establish to have this attribute of putting themselves on the line. And facilitating their own transformation. And then we think, well, a society and a culture that can do this is stronger. And it will produce power, including national power. But there will be a price to pay, which will be this tension and this disruption. And we won't be able to have a simple ideology that contrasts order and anarchy, in which every form of disruption is feared as a prefigurement of anarchy. We'll have to think the highest order is a kind of organized anarchy, which is another way to split the difference that Romanticism wants to insist on. So I think that in all these ideas, it's necessary, I'm repeating myself, to have a very general conception of us and of the direction, but at the same time, to enter into the technical details of each of these domains, the technology, education, and master them from within, but not surrender to them. And the kind of education I was describing before is an education to produce that kind of person. What kind of education can make a person like that? And that's a simple way to define what the goal is of the education. Now, the third set of requirements is the most difficult, the legal and institutional requirements. The basic analytic premise is the one that has kept recurring in the arguments here of the course. The basic analytic premise is that a market order, a decentralized economy, has no single natural and necessary form. And the potential of economic decentralization can be achieved only as we continue to experiment with its institutional forms. So the regime of private law, of property and contract, is the legal organization of a particular way of decentralizing economic opportunity. And on this view, there can be no such single way. So in principle, in the future, alternative regimes of property and contract should coexist experimentally within the same market order. So I want to go back to a thought experiment that I proposed much, much earlier in the course, weeks ago, about the ambiguity of the market concept. So I said, even at the most abstract level, the idea of a market economy has at least two distinct dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization, which is the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension is the degree of control that each of those agents enjoys over the productive resources at his command. So the traditional unified property right is the expression of absolute control. Absolute and in principle eternal through hereditary succession. And we traditionally think that these two dimensions of the abstract idea of the market are somehow inevitably linked, but they're not linked. And in fact, there's a tension between them. So we could imagine that we could extend the absolute level of economic decentralization giving more people access to more markets, more productive resources in more ways, by limiting the second dimension, that is to say, the absoluteness of the control, and having a system of temporary or conditional claims on productive resources. So, for example, the idea that the productive resources of society should be administered by the state, not through a system of discretionary allocation, but in effect by a process of bidding. Whoever can assure society of the highest rate of return for those productive resources gets to use them, while he can assure the highest rate of return. And so there's, as it were, a permanent auction of the productive resources of society. But in certain domains of economic activity, the traditional unified property right would continue to be useful, because one of its advantages is to allow an entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in at his own risk. So this is just an analytic clarification, because this explains the spirit of these remarks that I'm going to make about the legal and institutional evolution of the market economy as a background to the deepening and dissemination of this most advanced practice of production. We can imagine a series of stages going from the very moderate to the more radical. So at the first stage, the issue is how do we confront this abyss that has developed between the exclusive vanguard and all other parts of the production system. And so we need to have policies, arrangements that extend to a larger universe of firms that are in the rear guards, access to advanced technology, advanced practice, capital, and markets. Capital by itself is useless unless it's combined with the other instruments of advancement. Now, we could begin to think, for example, by analogy to 19th century agricultural extension. I gave the example in the first half of the 19th century, the Americans developed the most efficient system of family agriculture in the world. And the state, the government, both the federal government and the state governments, were allies of the family farmer, organizing the process of agricultural insurance, the food stockpiles, the price supports, even the land-grant colleges, which were the technical and scientific basis of agriculture. And this process of agricultural extension, in which the expert hired by the state came to the family farmer and explained to him in loco what the advanced practice required. It was the transmission belt of science to production at the grassroots. And an initial step in the dissemination of the market economy would then be the invention in the contemporary circumstances of equivalence to this procedure of agricultural extension. And that then would advance in parallel to what is already happening in the knowledge economy, which is the development of these collaborative networks among firms that are open-ended at their periphery, so that little by little, more firms can be sucked into the networks through this process of analogical extension. So then you could say, well, that's, as it were, that kind of thing, that kind of initiative, all of which is entirely feasible and in some sense already happening, could be seen then as the prefigurement of a second stage in which, out of these vertical and horizontal initiatives, vertical relations between the government and the firms and horizontal relations among firms, there begins to develop a new legal architecture of the market economy. And the new legal architecture, on its vertical axis, relations between governments and firms, would be characterized by a form of decentralized strategic partnership between the governments and the firms, not to the end of, quote, picking winners, subsidizing particular sectors or lines of production, but to the end of extending access and opportunity. And as part of this process, the state would have a particular interest in the development of the multi-sectoral technologies that are central to the advancement of the knowledge economy. And then on the horizontal axis of the relations among firms, the development of the practices of cooperative competition. Not cooperatives in the narrow sense, but this combination of the pooling of resources to achieve economies of scale with competition by distinct economic entities, in particular firms. And the characteristic legal device of cooperative competition is not the traditional bilateral executory promise, the fully articulated bargain at arm's length with instantaneous performance, but on the contrary, an incomplete, not fully bargained out relational agreement that is ongoing, and that rather than being exhausted in a single performance, has as its main object the relation itself and the indistinct, open-ended benefits that it can produce in the future. And then the third radical stage of the legal and institutional innovation would then have to do with the renewal, the innovation in the fundamental legal devices of economic decentralization, which are the regimes of property and of contract. Not a single regime of property and contract, but alternative regimes coexisting in the same market order. Why should the market economy be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself? There's an empirical question. What works best in what context? So, for example, if you start with the conventional conception of freedom of the economic agent to recombine factors of production within an untransformed legal institutional framework, which is the framework of the established regimes of property and contract, you can then radicalize this idea into the notion of freedom not just to recombine the factors of production, but also to innovate in the institutional framework itself. And then one of the forms that this radical innovation might take would be the regime of capital auctioning that I referred to a moment ago. There are pools of productive resources, and under fixed rules and standards, not under discretionary allocation, firms and groups of individuals get access to the productive resources in return for assuring a higher rate, in exchange for assuring a higher rate of return for the use of those productive resources. So if the knowledge economy is understood as a practice of radical experimentation in production, then it has to be extended into a practice of radical experimentation in the institutional framework of production, which is the organization of the market economy. So that's the general idea. And of course, the progression of change in this general direction, from the very modest first stage that I described at the outset to this radical last stage, would have to be sustained by the creation of a new set of social agents, of class alliances. So, for example, the world that is evoked by the third radical change is a world in which the traditional small business class, a major social and economic agent in the contemporary societies, could not have its present form. So the dominant economic aspiration in humanity is not a proletarian aspiration. It's not an aspiration to well-paid wage work in large factories and bureaucracies. It's an aspiration to a modicum of economic prosperity and independence, which by default, in most of the world, takes the form of identification with traditional, isolated, archaic family business, dependent on self-exploitation and family saving, and completely bereft of all of the practices that characterize the knowledge economy. So the small business class, for example, for this project to advance, would have to be pulled into the gravitational field of this new world of advanced productive practices and cease to have its fixation on this archaic, isolated family business. So the most important point to observe about this scheme that I just outlined methodologically is that if you look at it in the first stage, it's hardly an advance on what already exists. It's a set of very modest initiatives and improvements. But if you look at it at the last stage, it seems to be a radical transformation of the whole economic order. But what would be necessary is to imagine then the succession of steps that gets from the earliest stage to the last one. And it is only when it reaches that last stage, that then we have established a legal institutional framework hospitable to the widespread dissemination and deepening of the knowledge economy. In the absence of the transformation of the institutional framework, what we have is what exists in the world now, which is the knowledge economy as a characteristic product of a path of least resistance. There's a change, The change is associated with technologies, especially in high-tech manufacture, and it is then established in the world only in the form that least disturbs the dominant interest in the established preconceptions. And in that form of the path of least resistance, its potential cannot be achieved. So again, let me ask you then about this legal institutional argument. You see right away that how hard it is to assimilate this argument to the received apparatus of ideological controversy. Because what do we call this institutional alternative that I've just described? Do we call it capitalism? Do we call it socialism? It doesn't fit into the established ideological disputes because they're all premised on this hydraulic model of the state versus the market. And it's not about that. It's about a radical and progressive change, a cumulative change in the organization of economic decentralization, the reinvention of the market order, the radicalization of its logic. So what's most attractive about the idea of the market is its anarchic and experimental character, as what I described before as an organized anarchy. And the claim made by its defenders that it's a more promising instrument of discovery than the attempt to guide from the center. But if it is to be an organized anarchy, then we can't accept its present dogmatic form. We have to take it at its word and radicalize this anarchic and experimental impulse. And that's what this project is designed to do. So what would a market fundamentalist like Hayek say about that? I don't know. Because the philosophical argument made by someone like Hayek is the argument about the superiority of anarchic experimentalism over command and planning. But then that idea is associated with the notion, the false notion, I'm arguing, that a market order has a natural form. That if Robinson Crusoe trades on his island and trades long enough, he will eventually reproduce all of the legal institutions of 19th century German private law that will spontaneously arise from the trading activity. And that's the fallacy. And so when we get rid of the second idea, the idea that the natural destiny of the market order is the received apparatus of private law, the first idea, which is the idea of the anarchic experimentalism, begins to look completely different. It has a completely different set of consequences. And that's what's involved in this argument. That's the intellectual and ideological revolution that's at stake in this argument. So let me ask you, what do you think the main fragilities of this argument are? And how would a defender of the received notion, a Hayekian, for example, respond to it? So my experience of controversy, of argument, is that in the established climate of opinion, in which the persistent ideological assumption of the established economics is that the market economy does have a natural legal form. Whenever you make a proposal like these proposals summarized just now in these comments, the defender of the established view will interpret the proposal as the proposal for some kind of intervention in the market, because he associates the abstract idea of the market with the established version of the market. And so he understands any proposal to reshape the instruments of economic decentralization as a proposal to suppress the market. But it's not a proposal to suppress the market. It's a proposal to change the market and, in a sense, to radicalize the principle of economic decentralization. And so there's this initial confusion that has to be faced in the argument. Yes?
Do you think it's a logical fallacy, a mistake, confusion, or more an ideological choice? Partisan opinion.
Well, say more, what you mean.
I agree very much, and I share your argument that it's there's a fallacy on
Yes.
the Robinson Crusoe that at some point the market emerges
Yeah.
naturally as if it falls from the sky. But I think it's more of a constituent myth, a narrative that it's been developed and has ideological connotations. It's
Of course.
a mistake that's been done.
Of course. But this is mysterious. So you say it's ideological, but it's a proposition about the facts of the matter. That is, I gave the thought experiment about Robinson Crusoe. So the actual or imaginary Hayekian is claiming, it's a proposition about the facts, that if Robinson Crusoe trades long enough, eventually we will see him reproduce the system of private law of 19th century Germany. So they believe that. But it's false. And in fact, the single greatest analytical achievement of legal theory, I've said before here, in the period from 1850 to 1950, was the demolition of that idea. So the jurists, and including the conservative jurists, started out with this conception that the market has a natural legal and institutional content. But when they tried to work out that conception in detail, and the law is all about details, they discovered the opposite. Against their will, against their intentions. It was an involuntary discovery. So you start out from the abstract propositions about contract and property, and you translate them into succeeding levels of detail. And what you discover is that at each level down, there are choices to be made between different ways of organizing. And the choice cannot be made simply by inference from the more abstract conception of the market. So it turned out that the choices depend on conflicts of interest and vision that can't be reduced to inference from the abstract idea of the market. That's what they discovered. Jurists, for example, in the United States, like Oliver Wendell Holmes. And so it was the opposite of the idea with which they started. Now, what's interesting is that the conservative ideological conception, this Hayekian, this market fundamentalism, is the same conception of Marxism. It's the same thing. So the Marxist theory of so-called capitalism is the same thing. There's the mode of production. The mode of production has built into it a whole legal institutional content that is predetermined, that is a system. That's the same idea. of conservative practical economics. And it's the same idea that was subverted by the analytical work of legal theory. But what's astonishing is that this discovery of legal theory, even today, has not penetrated the inner world of practical economics. Now, when I say practical economics, it's to say that the pure economic theoreticians, like the mid-20th century theoreticians of general equilibrium, would never defend this idea. They would say that pure economic analysis is innocent of any institutional assumptions and commitments. It's the practical economists in their disputes about policy and explanation that then hedge on this theoretical proposition that it's institutionally empty. And these debates, which seem to be mere theoretical curiosities, turn out to have vital practical importance when we begin to discuss the direction. So the whole spirit of institutionally conservative social democracy, the default position of the progressives is the market is the market, just like the Hayekians. It's a wonderful instrument for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities. And now we're going to correct those inequalities after the fact through progressive taxation and social entitlements. That's how they think. So they also think that way. And it's another version of the same mistake. Because then we discover that the fundamental inequalities cannot be adequately corrected simply by this retrospective corrective distribution, only by change in the arrangements that shape the primary distribution of economic advantage, which gets us back to the same debate. So this is not a peripheral issue. This is a central question in which we must achieve clarity. Because if we make a mistake about this, we're going to make a mistake about everything else. And that's what happens in the familiar debates. Yes?
I mean, I kind of piggybacking on this discussion, it seems there's sort of two things going on, right? Because there were not just ideological Hayekian interests opposed to kind of this project. What you're proposing is a real material assault on entrenched interests.
Yes.
Above, right?
Yes.
And so, and I mean, I think there's been some revision of Hayek too to show that he was, and that the Austrian school was more concerned with projecting power than through the state than merely disassembling it.
Yes.
But this kind of discussion seems to ignore the path through the sort of institutional resistance that would come out from assaulting entrenched players.
Yes, absolutely. So it's true. So this whole argument, as I just couched it now, is only on the institutional side. But it's not on the other side, which is the side of what is the evolving set of class alliances, of group alliances, that would sustain this project. I just gave, as an aside, a fragmentary example of what I meant by the allusion to the small business class. And it's a crucial example because objectively, the small business class may be already larger in most of the world than the proletarians. And if we include in the small business class the participants in the so-called informal economy in countries like India and Brazil, it's the majority of the labor force. And independently of what its objective size is, subjectively, it is the predominant influence in the world, because the predominant aspiration is to this economic independence, which then, in the absence of other instruments, then gravitates to traditional, archaic, isolated family business. So we have to imagine the evolution of a set of alliances, class alliances including, that absorb the underclass of people in the informal economy, the small business class, and not just the organized minorities in the formal economy. And it's, of course, a vast political project, but in which the right way to think is that the programmatic institutional ideas and the ideas about class alliances are just two sides of the same operation. They're not separable. And that's because of this other feature that I referred to before, that any group or class interest can always be defined and defended in two sets of ways. So there's one set of way of defining and defending a class interest that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive. I gave the example. Say, the workers headquartered in the declining mass production industries. Who are their enemies? Their enemies are the groups closest to them. The subcontracted workers, the temporary workers, the small business class. And then the idea is their interest is to dig themselves into the niche of their present position in the production system against these neighboring groups. And that seems to be the best prospect in the short term, but it has no future. And the alternative is then to say, this has no future, and we need to convert mass production industry into something else. And in that project, those groups that we thought of as our adversaries must become our allies. The small business class, the subcontracted workers, and so forth. And this is the fundamental ambiguity in the understanding of class interest. And it's also based on a radically anti-Marxist assumption. So the assumption of Marxist theory is that the more conflict escalates in scope and intensity, the clearer the objective content of class interest becomes. So the industrial proletariat has one interest, the petty bourgeoisie has another interest, and the conflict escalates, and the objective substance of the interest becomes manifest. That's the Marxist thesis. It's the opposite of the truth. Because the truth is that as conflict escalates, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives in the space of the adjacent possible? And what would my interests become under those alternatives? So the issue of what are my interests then becomes inseparable from the question, what's possible at the next step? In other words, the impression of the objectivity of class interest turns out to be an illusion, which is dependent on stagnation and is subverted then by the escalation of conflict. So it turns the Marxist thesis on its head. And it's a completely different way of thinking about the agency of transformation, the relation between the agents and the alternatives. Now, just to say now in this final part that we can and should address the following question. I've described three sets of requirements: the institutional, legal, the social, moral, and the educational and cognitive. But we can and must ask the question, under what conditions is it more or less likely that a society would be able to satisfy those requirements? And those conditions seem to be fundamentally of two types: the political conditions and the cultural conditions. So then the argument is that the fundamental political condition is the deepening of democracy, the creation of a high-energy democracy that weakens the dependence of change on crisis, overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, and allows society to master the structure. And all the democracies that exist in the world are low-energy democracies. They're the opposite. And the other set of conditions are the cultural conditions. So what is required for these transformations to happen? The radicalization of an experimentalist impulse in every department of social life, so that the practice and the experience of disruption ceases to be an anomaly and becomes a pervasive aspect of our experience. Now, once again, we can ask of that change, as we asked of the disposition to cooperate, whether it is just a natural fact that we have to take for granted, or whether we can do something about it. And the idea is that we can do something about it. So, and here are three examples. So one is, think of the social inheritance, like universal basic income or a basic package of resources, not as a surrogate for a project of institutional transformation, but as one of its elements or presuppositions. So for people to be able to accept a radicalized conflict and experimentation in social life, they have to be unafraid and capable. They have to feel secure in a haven of vital protected interests and immunities. Now then, second, the dialectical character of education. So if the way in which we form our minds is always by a contrast of views, we begin to associate insight with the imagination of the possible and the practice of disruption. Or then that the state would have as one of its responsibilities to help individuals change direction in the middle of their lives, of their careers. And it would finance them and provide them opportunities for reskilling, so that the possibility of self-reinvention in the course of one's life would become a proper object of the policy of the state. Because it is in the interest of the state that everyone should be bigger, that we should enhance this power of agency, and that no individual should have this experience that in the world as it exists, almost every individual now has, which is he thinks in the middle of his life, this is the only life that I'm ever going to live. And I have to resign myself to it. And then a carapace of routine and compromise begins to form around me, and in that carapace I begin to die. And am denied the possibility, which we should all seek, of dying only once. So the practice of the knowledge economy, the project of its deepening and dissemination, touches on our most fundamental interests. But it touches in the following way. So it touches more by its deeper characteristics than by its superficial characteristics. It touches more by the requirements for its dissemination and diffusion than by the deeper characteristics. And it touches more by the conditions for the fulfillment of those requirements than by the fulfillment of those requirements. So in other words, it's the whole dynamic, it's the movement in this direction that has the largest transformative potential. To touch on this central object of our ambition, which is a shared bigness. will have a very good spring recess. And on the day in which you reappear here, I will assign to everyone the final writing exercise. See you then.
Will sometimes change things with absolutely no regard for anything that's happened previously. I guess in the spirit of like the letter of the so it could be yes, or it starts in now. You saw that with the we tell you what, for pundits things or whatever, I feel like it's always you see the YouTube video about he's got those talk about his dreams. So that's it. So basically, in this documentary, just like the thing was like, I used to regularly have this dream. This dream is about this like brook in the south of Brazil, which is kind of bubbling and it's hundreds from underneath. And he's on the north of Brazil, and there's these big mountains, which is like basically he's like that's all like that is everything I've ever lived. It's the combination of movability, firmness of history and of destiny and of society versus like endless versus irrepressibility is like he places all on this dream. Yeah, I actually thought he was going to do it, like he's just quite a philosophy about that because he's going to live a dream.